A traumatized World War I veteran sat in his Oxford office, haunted by images of friends dying in trenches. To escape the nightmares, he scribbled 11 words that would accidentally create a billion-dollar industry and change storytelling forever. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. He had no idea what a hobbit was, where this sentence came from, or that this random moment of trauma-induced escape would become the blueprint for how millions cope with modern life. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien stared at those 11 words and felt completely puzzled. What was a hobbit? What did it look like? Why did it live in a hole? The war-damaged professor found himself in the peculiar position of having to discover his own creation. He later recalled, "I did nothing more about it for a long time, and for some years I got no further than the production of Thror's map." But that single sentence had planted a seed that would grow into something extraordinary, and you felt its impact every time you've binged fantasy shows or lost hours in imaginary worlds. The whole itself became more than just a story detail. It was Tolkien's unconscious solution to everything that terrified him. In the trenches, he'd watched artillery shells blast craters in the earth, turning the ground into a nightmare landscape of mud and death. But hobbits lived in holes by choice, making them cozy, safe, decorated with round doors and warm fireplaces. Every time you choose Netflix over the news, every time you dive into a video game when reality feels overwhelming, you're essentially crawling into your own hobbit hole. The comfort of fantasy worlds isn't escapism, it's survival. This wasn't just any professor having a creative moment. Tolkien was living through the tense years between two devastating world wars, teaching at Oxford during a time when civilization itself seemed broken. The Great War had already shattered his generation, taking his closest friends, and dark clouds were gathering again across Europe. Sound familiar? Just like you might scroll through fantasy content when real life feels overwhelming, Tolkien found himself yearning for something that didn't exist, a place of wonder, adventure, and most importantly, hope. The specific trauma ran deeper than most people realize. On July 1, 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, Tolkien crouched in a communications trench as machine gun fire mowed down 60,000 British soldiers in a single day. His job was to coordinate artillery strikes while watching his childhood friends die around him. Geoffrey Smith, who had shared poetry and dreams with Tolkien since school days, was killed by a shell blast. Robert Gilson, another member of their tight brotherhood, fell to machine gun fire. These weren't statistics. They were the people who had shaped Tolkien's creative spirit, and their loss left him psychologically shattered. The nightmares never stopped. Even decades later, Tolkien would wake in his Oxford bedroom hearing the whistle of incoming shells. His wife Edith learned to recognize the signs, the way his hands would shake over morning tea, how he'd stare at nothing for long minutes. Writing became his therapy, but not in any clinical sense. When he wrote about hobbit holes, he was writing about safety. When he wrote about friendship between unlikely companions, he was honoring the bonds forged in trenches. When he wrote about evil forces threatening peaceful lands, he was processing a world where civilization could collapse overnight. Oxford in the 1930s was a world of scholarly tradition, where professors debated ancient languages and dissected classical literature with surgical precision. Tolkien fit this world perfectly, being a language expert who could trace the evolution of words across centuries. But he had a secret passion that his colleagues found frivolous. He loved fairy tales. Not just reading them, but the very idea that stories could transport readers to worlds where magic was real and heroes could triumph against impossible odds. This is exactly why you lose yourself in fantasy games or binge entire seasons in one sitting. His colleagues at Oxford viewed fantasy literature with barely concealed disdain. Fairy stories are for children, they'd mutter over sherry at faculty gatherings. Serious academics don't waste time with such nonsense. Tolkien felt the sting of their judgment acutely. Here he was, a respected professor of Anglo-Saxon literature, secretly spending his evenings crafting tales about dragons and magical rings. The academic pressure was immense. Publish serious scholarly work or risk your career. Fantasy novels were seen as intellectual suicide for a university professor. The financial pressure made everything worse. Academic salaries in 1930s, Oxford barely covered living expenses for a family with 4 children. Tolkien's wife, Edith, watched their household budget with growing anxiety. Every evening spent writing stories was an evening not spent on scholarly articles that might bring in extra income. "Perhaps you should focus on your academic work," she'd suggest gently, not understanding that the stories weren't a hobby, they were keeping her husband sane. Every Tuesday evening, Tolkien would meet with fellow Oxford professors called the Inklings. The most famous member was C.S. Lewis, who would later write The Chronicles of Narnia. These men would gather in the back room of the Eagle and Child pub, smoking pipes and reading their latest writings aloud. It was in this supportive circle that Tolkien first shared the emerging story of Bilbo Baggins, testing each chapter on friends who understood the power of imaginative escape. The Inklings' meetings were far from polite literary discussions. They were intellectual battlegrounds where brilliant minds clashed over every paragraph. Lewis, in particular, could be brutally honest. "This section drags. Tollers," he'd say, using Tolkien's nickname, "the reader will lose interest." Sometimes Tolkien would storm home, convinced his story was worthless. Other nights, when Lewis praised a particular scene or Charles Williams gasped at a plot twist, Tolkien felt vindicated. These weren't just friends offering encouragement, they were his first audience, and their reactions shaped every chapter. One particular evening in 1933, Tolkien arrived at the Eagle and Child with a specific scene, Smate Bilbo's confrontation with the dragon Smaug. He'd been struggling with it for weeks, unsure whether a conversation between a small hobbit and a massive dragon could carry dramatic weight. As he read aloud, describing Smaug's voice like a bass organ playing funeral music, the room fell silent. When he finished, Lewis leaned back in his chair and said, "By God, Tollers, that's the most terrifying thing I've ever heard." That validation gave Tolkien the confidence to push forward with increasingly ambitious scenes. But Tolkien's gift for fantasy wasn't born from academic comfort. It was forged in trauma. As a young man, he had served as a communications officer in the Battle of the Somme, one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. He watched friends die in the muddy trenches of France, including two of his closest companions from school. The war taught him that evil was real and devastating, but it also convinced him that courage could be found in the most unlikely places. This is why every fantasy hero you love, from Harry Potter to your favorite game character, starts as an ordinary person thrust into extraordinary circumstances. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how trauma creates the stories that heal us, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We've got many more literary adventures ahead. And let us know in the comments, what fantasy world do you escape to when life gets tough? Tolkien's obsession with language bordered on the extreme. As a child, he had created his own languages for fun, meticulously working out grammar rules and vocabulary. By the time he was writing The Hobbit, he had already spent years developing Elvish languages, complete with historical evolution and regional dialects. Most fantasy creators build a story and then add magical elements. But Tolkien worked backwards. He created languages and then built entire civilizations to speak them. This is why Middle-earth feels more real than most fantasy worlds you encounter today. Consider how this works in practice. When Tolkien wrote the Elvish phrase "A Elbereth Gilthoniel," he wasn't just creating mysterious-sounding words. He was crafting a prayer in a fully functional language with verb conjugations, noun declensions, and poetic meter rules. Each syllable carried emotional weight because it emerged from a complete linguistic system. This is why Elvish feels hauntingly beautiful rather than randomly mystical. You're hearing the echoes of thousands of hours of linguistic development. This obsessive attention to language authenticity explains why modern fantasy often feels hollow by comparison. When you watch a fantasy show where characters speak ancient languages that are obviously English words with changed vowels, your brain subconsciously recognizes the fakeness. Tolkien's languages feel ancient because they follow the same evolutionary patterns as real ancient languages. Every fantasy world since has been measured against this standard, and most fall short. When The Hobbit was published in 1937, it achieved something remarkable. It appealed equally to children and adults. The story followed a perfect pattern that felt both familiar and revolutionary. Bilbo begins as the epitome of comfortable routine, living in his well-appointed hole, following predictable patterns, avoiding anything that might disrupt his peaceful existence. When Gandalf and 13 dwarves arrive with tales of distant mountains and sleeping dragons, Bilbo's first instinct is to refuse. We are plain, quiet folk and have no use for adventures. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things. make you late for dinner. This internal conflict between comfort and calling would become the template for every reluctant hero in fantasy that followed. Think about it. You recognize this pattern because it's in every story you love. Tolkien understood that audiences don't want perfect heroes, who struggle with fear and doubt, who grow stronger through adversity, who discover courage they never knew they possessed. The publishing journey itself nearly killed the book before it began. Publishers in 1930s London wanted either serious literature or obvious children's books, nothing that might appeal to both audiences. What exactly is this? One publisher asked Tolkien's agent, "Is it for children or adults?" When Tolkien replied, "Both," the publisher shook his head. "That's not how books work. Pick an audience." 3 publishers rejected The Hobbit outright, calling it neither fish nor fowl. Tolkien began to doubt whether his story had any commercial value at all. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. A 10-year-old boy named Rayner Unwin, son of publisher Stanley Unwin. Stanley gave the manuscript to his son with a promise of $1 for an honest review. Young Rayner wrote, "This book, with the help of maps, does not need any illustrations. It is good and should appeal to all children between the ages of 5 and 9. That single review from a child convinced Stanley Unwin to take the financial risk. Sometimes the youngest voices carry the most truth. The dragon Smaug became the archetypal fantasy dragon, the template against which all others are measured. Tolkien drew from his deep knowledge of ancient literature, but he made Smaug psychologically complex in ways ancient dragons weren't. This wasn't just a mindless beast. Smaug was intelligent, cunning, and possessed of terrible pride. His death doesn't come through mighty sword work, but through clever exploitation of his one weakness, discovered through wit rather than warrior strength. Every boss battle you've ever fought follows this pattern. Smaug's personality reveals Tolkien's genius for psychological depth. The dragon doesn't just hoard gold, he memorizes every piece, knows exactly when something is missing, and takes personal offense at theft. "My armor is like tenfold shields." Smaug boasts, but his true armor is his ego. When Bilbo flatters him as Smaug the Mighty, the dragon preens with pleasure, revealing the vanity that becomes his downfall. This psychological complexity made Smaug the template for every intelligent villain since, from Hannibal Lecter to Voldemort. The most terrifying antagonists are those who combine power with personality. A famous scene where Bilbo talks with Smaug demonstrates something revolutionary in children's literature: the power of conversation over violence. Instead of solving problems through sword fights, Tolkien shows a small person using wit, words, and psychology to survive an encounter with ultimate evil. This scene taught every thriller writer since that the most dangerous moments can happen through conversation, not just action. When you watch characters engage in verbal sparring matches in modern shows, you're seeing Bilbo's influence. The most famous scene in The Hobbit, Bilbo's riddle contest with Gollum in the dark tunnels beneath the misty mountains, showcases Tolkien's mastery of suspense. Each riddle follows traditional patterns, but Tolkien crafted them with modern sensibility. The tension builds as life or death stakes hang on wordplay. This scene taught every thriller writer since that the most dangerous moments can happen through conversation, not just action. The riddles themselves reveal Tolkien's understanding of how language creates intimacy even between enemies. What has roots as nobody sees is taller than trees. Up, up it goes, and yet never grows. When Gollum answers mountain, there's a moment of shared delight in the cleverness of wordplay. Even in this life or death contest, both characters enjoy the mental challenge. This humanizes Gollum in ways that pure combat never could, making him tragic rather than simply evil. Tolkien's approach to world building was revolutionary because of his scholarly background, but also his understanding of trauma. He didn't just invent fantasy elements, he created them with the same care he applied to healing his war wounds. Every place name had roots, every culture had depth, every song carried emotional weight. When Bilbo encounters the Wood Elves or the Men of Lake Town, these aren't just plot devices, they feel like real refuges from a harsh world. The book's success surprised everyone, including Tolkien himself. Publishers immediately began pressuring him for a sequel, not realizing they were requesting what would become The Lord of the Rings, a work that would take Tolkien 12 more years to complete and nearly drive him to another breakdown. But The Hobbit had already accomplished something extraordinary. It proved that fantasy literature could be more than escapism. It could be healing. The pressure for a sequel created an unexpected crisis. Tolkien had poured his trauma into The Hobbit and found peace in its completion. Now, publishers wanted him to revisit that psychological space, to dive back into the darkness he'd just escaped. "I cordially hate allegory in all its manifestations," he wrote to a friend, frustrated by demands that he explain what The Hobbit really meant. The book wasn't a coded message. It was therapy made public. Financial pressures made the sequel demand impossible to ignore. The Hobbit's success meant real money for the first time in Tolkien's adult life. His children could attend better schools, his wife could stop worrying about household expenses, and he could focus on writing without constant financial stress. But the psychological cost was enormous. Creating Middle-earth required returning to the darkest corners of his war-damaged mind, and he wasn't sure he could survive that journey twice. Don't forget to share this video with fellow story lovers. Understanding how trauma creates the stories that save us reminds us why these tales matter. The cultural impact of The Hobbit exploded in unexpected ways. During the 1960s counterculture movement, young people discovered Middle-earth as an alternative to an increasingly mechanized modern world. Frodo Lives graffiti appeared on subway walls, and Tolkien's vision of pastoral peace resonated with a generation questioning technological progress. This wasn't what the conservative Oxford professor had intended, but it demonstrated something powerful. Too far, fantasy becomes real when people need hope. The numbers tell the story of The Hobbit's cultural dominance. The global fantasy entertainment industry is now worth over $25 billion annually. Video games, movies, books, merchandise, streaming shows. Every piece of that industry traces back to Tolkien's traumatized scribbling in 1930. When you spend hours building in Minecraft, you're following the same creative impulse that drove Tolkien to construct Middle-earth. When you argue about Marvel plot holes online, you're engaging with fictional worlds the same way scholars debate Tolkien's mythology. Consider your own fantasy consumption habits. The average person spends over 6 hours daily consuming some form of entertainment, with fantasy content dominating streaming platforms, gaming, and social media. This isn't coincidence. It's psychological necessity. Just as Tolkien needed hobbit holes to heal from trench warfare, modern audiences need fictional worlds to process information overload, economic anxiety, and social isolation. Fantasy isn't escape from reality. It's practice for surviving reality. Every fantasy experience you love owes a debt to The Hobbit. Gary Gygax credited it as inspiration for Dungeons, Dragons, which influenced video games, which influenced films and streaming series. J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter follows the same pattern of an ordinary person discovering a magical world. J.R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, despite its darker tone, uses Tolkien's detailed world-building approach. Even modern superhero stories echo Bilbo's arc of reluctant heroism. The influence runs deeper than surface similarities. Tolkien established the fundamental rule that fantasy worlds must have internal consistency. Magic systems with rules, languages with grammar, cultures with history. Before Tolkien, fantasy stories could introduce arbitrary magical solutions to any problem. After Tolkien, audiences demanded that fictional worlds operate according to discoverable principles. This is why you get frustrated when fantasy shows break their own rules. Tolkien trained us to expect logical consistency even in impossible worlds. But perhaps most importantly, Tolkien elevated storytelling by refusing to write down to his audience. He used sophisticated themes, genuine emotion, and real consequences. He trusted readers to understand that adventures involve actual danger, that heroes sometimes fail, that victory often comes at great cost. This is why the fantasy you consume today treats you like an intelligent adult, not a child. Bilbo's character arc established the template for the modern hero's journey in fantasy. Unlike classical heroes who begin with noble birth or obvious destiny, Bilbo starts as an ordinary middle-class citizen, AAI, just like you. His heroism emerges not from superhuman abilities, but from moral choices made in difficult circumstances. When he spares Gollum's life, when he tries to prevent war between former allies, when he gives up his share of treasure, Bilbo demonstrates that true courage often means doing the right thing when no one is watching. The specific moment of Bilbo's transformation happens not in combat, but in an act of mercy. When he holds the sword to Gollum's throat and chooses not to strike, Bilbo becomes something more than an adventurer. He becomes someone who breaks cycles of violence rather than perpetuating them. This scene established the moral framework for every fantasy hero since. True strength isn't the ability to destroy enemies, but the wisdom to create friends. This psychological insight explains why Bilbo resonates across generations. Every person faces moments where they must choose between self-interest and moral courage, between safety and growth, between revenge and mercy. Bilbo's choices give readers a template for their own moral development. He proves that heroism isn't about being fearless, it's about acting courageously despite fear. The enduring appeal of there and back again. Bilbo's subtitle for his own story speaks to something deep in human nature. We crave adventure, but we also want the security of home. This is exactly why you binge fantasy content. You want to experience danger and wonder while knowing you'll return safely to familiar comfort. Bilbo comes home changed but not broken, enriched by experience but still fundamentally himself. The circular journey structure became the template for almost every fantasy story that followed. Heroes must leave safety, face trials that transform them, and return home with wisdom to share. This pattern appears in everything from Star Wars to The Matrix because it mirrors the psychological process of personal growth. We all must leave our comfort zones, face our fears, and integrate our experiences into a stronger sense of self. The most remarkable aspect of The Hobbit's creation remains that moment of traumatic inspiration while grading papers. Tolkien later said he had no memory of writing those first words, no plan for where they might lead. His damaged mind, seeking escape from war memories, created something that would help millions of other damaged minds find their own escape routes. The unconscious nature of this creative act reveals something profound about how trauma transforms into art. Tolkien didn't deliberately set out to create a healing narrative. B.A.T. His psyche did it automatically, the same way physical wounds form scars. The story emerged because it needed to exist, because the human mind demands meaning even in the face of senseless suffering. That single sentence, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," didn't just change literature. It became the coping mechanism for everyone who's ever needed to believe that ordinary people can survive extraordinary trials and make it home again. Thanks for joining us on this journey through trauma, healing, and the stories that save us. If you've ever used fantasy to escape reality, subscribe for more revelations about the damaged minds that created the world you love, and let us know which story helped you survive your darkest moments.